when you were at Fisk, if I could be wrong, but if I remember, you did your thesis on domestic work?
Domestic workers.
Okay.
I have a couple of copies of it here. It was the domestic workers. It's really a I must say, I've been rereading it. It's a pioneering work. It's on domestic workers in relation to trade unionism.
Oh, wow.
And what I did is I went to the cities in the United States, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and New York, where there had been attempts made to organize domestic workers. Interviewed the people who were trying to organize them. Went down to what they used to call in the Bronx, the slave marts, where people would show up, and these white women from Long Island, Westchester, and everything would come and pick out a domestic worker and ask them for the day. Size them up like they were slaves, whether they looked healthy, whether they could do a good day's work for. And this was widespread I think in a number of urban areas at that time. And I contrasted, and I had, in my thesis, I had sample contracts of for unionization and everything. And I interviewed people, the organizers, I interviewed domestic workers in a number of cities. I read a lot of stuff on domestic work in the Soviet Union, on the dignity of, at that time, they were putting all of this, not that soon after the revolution and everything, on the dignity of domestic work. Unfortunately, the West, with all this tourism and everything, has had a big influence there. But at that time, it was that a domestic worker's job, a woman who worked in a hotel or whatever her job was a skill which was on the par with any other contributor to the society. And so I read everything I could on the attitude of a socialist government toward, and I contrasted that, and I had all my references were in contrast between capitalists, and by the way, my advisor there was a communist, but they didn't know it at this. My advisor on my dissertation on the faculty. Yeah, and he was one of the people who had, because of the way I discussed things in class, had asked me to join this little group of people. And so I contrasted the attitude toward domestic work in a capitalist society and a socialist society. And I didn't have, somehow or other, an interesting part, I must say, this is a very personal part of it. My mother typed my master's thesis. I didn't have a lot of money. I was working and living in a settlement house, a Methodist settlement house in Fisk. And I had a fellowship that covered my tuition. And I didn't have a lot of money. So I didn't want to pay anybody to type my dissertation. I typed, but I didn't type that well. My mother, who was an expert speed typist and had been in the government for years, said she would do it. And when I told Charles Johnson about it, I said, I'm mailing my mother everything. And some of it I had typed. It was partly typed and partly handwritten. And I sent it to my mother in Arlington, and I took out of the Fisk Library a thesis that had been typed and bound so she could see the Fisk way of doing it. And I mailed it to my mother, and it was perfect. Absolutely. She made they didn't have, as you know, Xerox machines. She had to put 4 or 5 sheets of carbon paper between each sheet of paper. So you can imagine if she made even one error. They didn't have all this liquid correction in those days. All they had was erasers. So what she would do if she made a mistake was take the whole sheet out and start over again. And it's a couple of 100 pages. And she typed it and mailed it back to me. And when Charles Johnson looked at it, he was delightfully surprised. I had 2 copies. And I loaned both of them. One was to a communist organizer in Brooklyn who left the party and left, and I never got it back. So when I went to Fisk about 5 years ago, my husband and I were driving through the South on our first trip since desegregation. We went to the Fisk Library, and a woman there, the librarian, went up and got a copy and Xeroxed the whole dissertation for me. And that's how I got my thesis back.
They have a copy at the Tamiment.
I didn't know that.
Institute, right, at NYU.
Oh, I'm glad to know
Yeah.
that. I didn't know.
What they try to do is they try to collect all the master's and doctoral theses by radicals with socialist.
No, I didn't even know I was there.
Yeah, so.
Of course, the Library of Congress has a copy.
Yeah.
Because people have seen, I know they had it, because they also tried to collect it one period in special themes, but I haven't gone back there to use it. I got my copy from the Fisk Library.
So now, was Charles Johnson on your committee at all when you were doing this work?
No, Addison Cutler was the main person who was my advisor. And Charles Johnson, the reason, he was head of the department, and he just had to give, what shall I say, and Robert Park was also in residence that year. Several years I was there, from Chicago. And Charles Johnson had to give the final okay to the dissertation and to the oral. They gave you had an oral exam. I think they were much more rigid about masters than they are now. I'm sure that's like in many other places. It's probably much easier. But they were very rigid then.
I see. Yeah, they're rigid now, but the difference is you have computers.
Yeah.
They set the margins for you. Know?
Yeah, well, all that my mother had to do and measure.
Yeah.
And one of my sisters was living at the home at that time, and she said that you had to tiptoe around the house. She would say, "Don't speak to me until I finish Esther's thesis."
Wow.